Okay. I want to say thank you to Kurt. He's not here this morning, but I appreciate very much him filling in last week for us in Acts and teaching the class for me while I was away. And I thought he did an excellent job with that. And so I appreciate him standing in for me. Perhaps you prefer him more than me after that. So we'll see if we can live up to Kurt this week. We begin here after the events in Acts, the 15th chapter, which Kurt covered, dealing with circumcision. And one of the last things that occurred in Acts, the 15th chapter, is a disagreement between Paul and Barnabas. And unfortunately, that event would lead to them splitting. And one of the things that I wanted to stress on that was that it was from the words that were used, the word that Luke used, it was a very, very sharp and heated disagreement between Paul and Barnabas. And so that may lead into some of the things we're going to discuss this morning about Paul and the way he may react to certain events that occur. And I don't want to paint a negative picture of Paul. I think I've got to believe, based upon other things that are written, that Paul says about Barnabas, that there may have been some reconciliation on that and some smoothing over of whatever happened between Paul and Barnabas. But for whatever the case may be, it obviously separates two very dynamic evangelists, preachers, and teachers of the gospel. But I believe it ends up being something that is for good, because it actually allows more work to be done. And God uses it again for the spreading of his kingdom. It may look bad on the surface, like some of the things that occur and that have occurred in Acts, but God uses all of these things to his ultimate glory and his ultimate plan. And so that brings us up to Acts, the 16th chapter, and Paul and Silas have set out previously at the end of Acts chapter 15, and we find them on Paul's second missionary journey here in Acts, the 16th chapter. Now, where we find them all at this time is back where they kind of were at the end of Paul's first missionary journey, over in Galatia, the modern-day part of Turkey. And it seems, based upon where they are and what's going on, that they are kind of rehashing the things that they did, or at least Paul did, in the first missionary journey. I think that's going to come to an abrupt end, and it's going to be actually navigated in a different direction by God, by some of the things that occur. So again, we look at where we are in the events and in the timeline, and you can see that we're here in the end of 49, and we're talking 49, 50, 51, 52 for this second missionary journey. We, of course, have had the Jerusalem conference, whatever you may want to call it, where the church there has to address this issue of false teaching dealing with circumcision, and then we jump into this. The book of Galatians is probably written between this second missionary journey and the events and the first mission journey, somewhere dealing with maybe some of the things that were going on with these false teachers who were spreading around, and obviously dealing with the church there in Antioch of Syria. So Paul has probably written that book already, and he's kind of returned to this area. And in fact, we're going to find him in Lystra here in Acts 16. And so here we see quickly a map of where we're discussing. And we start off coming out of Antioch and going into the areas that he was in Galatia. And then, obviously, there's going to be some events that occur that shape him and push him over to the continent of Europe, which obviously is a major, major important step in the spread of the gospel. So we're heading to Europe. We're about to get there, but we got to first make a stop here in Lystra. So that's where we pick up in Acts 16. And so in Acts 16, they arrive in Lystra. And do we remember one of the things that occurred in Lystra in the first missionary journey of note? What happened specifically to Paul in Lystra? What's that? So they're worshipped as gods, so they're worshipped as gods there, but that quickly kind of transitions whenever he says, no, 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 we're not gods. And of course, that's when they kind of go, oh, you're not. And then the Jews show up. And what ends up happening to Paul at that point? You get stoned. And so you kind of have to believe you're not that many years after that event. He's back in Lystra. The church there has been obviously established and has been growing in the time since Paul has left. And you would believe that the people there would have probably talked about that incident that occurred. Hey, Paul got stoned the last time he was here, and now he's here again. Or talked about it in the intervening time period. And so Timothy, who's there in Lystra, probably has heard the story about Paul being stoned, knows about Paul. He would have grown up hearing about this. So we have Timothy here kind of growing up in this dynamic environment of this church and of the growth of the church and the establishment of the church, not only in Lystra, but of course around the known world at this time. And so here comes Paul into Lystra, and you have a very young Timothy there. Now, what we learn about Timothy is who are his mother and his father? What do we know about them? Okay, so who's the Jew and who's the Greek? Mom's a Jew, father's Greek. And so, was Timothy circumcised? No, he was not. So Timothy was not circumcised. This was part of the whole discussion that was occurring in the previous chapter that brings about Paul getting extremely upset about what was being taught, because I think he understood the absolute devastating impact that was having upon these Gentile Christians. They were being told, you've got to be circumcised, and this was going to have a chilling effect upon the spread of the gospel, and it absolutely was not the intention that God had for the church. And so you bring into this that environment, that mix, and then you have Timothy here who had not been circumcised, who has been very active, obviously. What does it say about Timothy? What do we find out about Timothy? Isn't he someone that is well known not only by the church there in Lystra, but what other city knows about him? Not far away. Iconium knows about him. So we have Lystra and Iconium, and they both know he's spoken well in both places. So obviously, Timothy has already been active. He's obviously already had an impact in that area. And so Timothy is someone that may be a natural fit for what Paul is wanting to do and to go to Jesus. So obviously, Paul brings him in. But that leads to an interesting event here. Paul decides he's going to circumcise Timothy. Now, we've just had the discussion in Acts 15. Why would Paul, after being so strenuously objecting to having the Gentiles circumcised, to enter into a relationship with Jesus Christ, you don't have to bring on the law, you don't have to be circumcised. Why does he have Timothy circumcised after all of that? Because of what? The Jews. And why do you say that? Why don't we bring up the mic over here, Matthew? So our people online can actually hear. Why would you say the Jews in this case?
Well, in verse 3, it says, because the Jews who were in those places. So it's their bias and their prejudice. And so he didn't want that to be an issue and, get in the way of them spreading the word.
Okay, so in fact, verse 3 tells us, you're exactly right. It's because of the Jews. They knew that his father was a Greek, and so this was something that was going to hinder the preaching of the gospel. Galatians 2. Who has Galatians 2 here real quick? Sorry, and I'll get over to Jim. I'll go to James first. Can we get James a mic here so we can read Galatians chapter 2?
This is Galatians 2, 3 through 5. But even Titus, who was with me, was not forced to be circumcised, though he was a Greek. Yet because of false brothers secretly brought in, who slipped in to spy out our freedom that we have in Jesus Christ, so that they might bring us into slavery, to them we did not yield in submission even for a moment, so that the truth of the gospel might be preserved for you. Okay,
so there we have Titus, him saying this, and probably need to read this before. We talked about verse 3. But in Galatians, and as I said, that letter is probably written, if you believe the Southern Galatian, the South Galatian theory, that it's written before the events that occur in Acts chapter 15. Then you see that Titus, who is a Gentile, was not even circumcised, yet he takes Timothy to do it. But the answer becomes, he's trying to make sure that he doesn't do anything to hinder the spread of the gospel. And I think that's something that we obviously can take to heart here and understand. When we are trying to spread the gospel, how are we, there's conforming to the world and being like it, which we cannot do. But there's also making sure that we make ourselves acceptable to people so that they will be willing to listen to what we say. And how do we approach people so that we don't immediately turn them off and make them unreceptive to the gospel? That's Paul's issue here. How do I make myself acceptable to other people? Let's go over here. Sorry, Jim.
That's all right. So with this, I must admit, this is one of the most confusing passages in the New Testament for me.
Where you get some circumcised and everything?
Yeah, where in one chapter he says, don't listen to him, and then he turns around and does that. I don't think by any means there's any hypocrisy here. I feel like it may fall under the heading of, I become all things to all people so that I might save some. And if your answer to that is yes, which I think it might be, what is an example or examples that this group could come up with of 21st century behavior that would, somewhat parallel what Paul did here?
Yeah, that is an excellent question. And real quick before we start going around, I have 1 Corinthians. Who's got 1 Corinthians? I think that's got to be, Jared's got it over here. Matthew, can you get him a mic real quick? You actually nailed it. And that is an excellent question, and I hope we have some people with some answers because I see some hands up. So I see two over here. So we're going to have two. Matthew, you can go ahead. Go ahead, Jared, though.
Okay.
You've been waiting patiently.
1 Corinthians 9:19 through 23. Though I am free and belong to no one, I have made myself a slave to everyone, to win as many as possible. To the Jews, I became like a Jew, to win the Jews. To those under the law, I became like the one under the law, though I myself am not under the law, so as to win those under the law. To those not having the law, I became like the one not having the law. To those not having the law, I became like one not having the law, though I am not free from God's law, but under Christ's law, so as to win those not having the law. To the weak I became weak to win the weak. I have become all things to all people, so that by all possible means I might save some. I do all this for the sake of the gospel, that I may share in its blessings.
Thank you, Jared. And that's exactly the scripture you're quoting, Jim, there as you begin your comment. Let's go ahead. We've got two comments over here, and we'll go Curtis, and then we can get her the mic so she can be ready to go.
I think the difference between Titus and Timothy is the fact that according to Jewish reckoning, maternity was much easier to prove than paternity. So if someone was from a mixed background, the mother, if she was Jewish, that meant the child was Jewish. If the father was Jewish, that didn't necessarily mean that the child was Jewish. So here you had someone who apparently for all of his life was hindered in his dealings with the Jews because he was considered an unfaithful Jew.
Because he wasn't circumcised.
Because he wasn't circumcised. The Apostle Paul, by having him circumcised, expedites his work in the synagogue that he would have probably been excluded from otherwise.
Absolutely.
Titus, on the other hand, if he'd had him circumcised, that would have been hypocritical and made it look like circumcision was necessary for Gentiles, and made it look like, that here he was agreeing to something that he didn't agree to. So I think that's the big difference between these two men and the two circumstances.
Yeah, that's actually, I hadn't even thought about that, but you're exactly right. I mean, a lot easier to point to the mother here and say, he's a Jew. And you're exactly right. He would have been seen as not not conforming to being circumcised. And that, of course, that would have been required, whether his mother was or his father was, as far as the Jewish people were concerned. So, no, I hadn't thought about that.
I think excellent point brought up, first of all, by Curtis. And to go along with that, I don't think it's an accident that we have examples of both. And I think with Paul, what he did with Timothy, I think it was necessary then to have another example of him explaining the reasoning with Titus, so that doesn't get confused as a you all have to do this type thing for us reading it today. To answer Jim's question about present day examples of becoming all things to all people, I look at it this way, and this is purely based on our own experiences, living in different places and moving a lot and living in different countries and amongst different cultures. I look at that as an example. Sometimes it's easy to get fixated on our little box if we're, especially if we've spent the majority of our life in one place.
Right.
But churches look different all over the world.
Sure.
And cultures and people look different all over the world. And their custom and their interpretation of what is right and what is proper or what is modest or, any of those things is different all over the world. And so even if we don't need to conform to those things based on scripture,
sure,
by conforming to those things for the sake of winning others is I think applies in this situation. I had a friend in elementary school that her dad had to go work in Saudi Arabia for a while.
Yeah,
so her and her sisters and her mother had to, they dressed in like full, everything covered. So I'm not saying we need to do that, but it was an example of them conforming to the cultural norms,
right?
Out of respect for people around them.
Yeah, and if we can get a mic up here real quick. Thank you, Shannon. I think, and that's an actual excellent point you make about especially conforming to the cultural norms in an area, and you're right. I mean, it's easy if you live here and you spend all your time here or spend wherever it may be that's culturally similar. You're like, okay, well, there's not much difference. But you do go, as you travel around the United States, you do see differences in churches depending on where they are. You definitely see differences as soon as you leave the United States. I mean, and many of us have not traveled extensively across the world, but we have had evangelists come and show us who do work, who do not live in the United States, who live in foreign countries, and they do work in their own country, but in others as well. And you see a marked difference in the way they approach it, but it doesn't mean that, well, we're right, they're wrong, or this is the right way, this is the wrong way. But if you go there, how are you going to have an impact upon the culture there if you don't at least look a lot like them and act like them? And I think you're right here. Paul's saying here, I've got to become like all of these in these many cultural aspects so that they don't look at me and go, who are you? You're a foreigner. You don't know anything about us, and you certainly don't respect us. I think we've got a comment over here in just a moment. But go ahead, Mary.
Well, I was going to say the same thing you said. I don't remember if y'all remember when Brother Skoltz came. He was talking about the congregation.
Yeah, that's who I was thinking of.
That's what I was thinking of, because he said that the women in some of those congregations have to sit out on the outside on the ground, where the men are the ones who actually sit in the pews, or what we would say pews, the chairs.
Yeah.
I was in another congregation when I was in. We were in Kerrville, and a gospel preacher came, and he speaks in the Spanish-speaking a lot of in other countries, and he said, like, the women have to sit on one side, the men on the other, and you really don't address the women really that much. And he said it's just the culture of the congregation that you go to, and so yes, we're like Shannon said, we live differently here in a lot of respects.
Yes, we do.
And so you do have to consider how other people feel under different circumstances and what they're going to do. And it also, I remember years ago, one of the elders was speaking that at another congregation, that a family that had come from Catholicism was very adamant about not having anything to do with December 25th.
Mm-hmm.
And when they actually came to the
Yep.
elders, the elder was going to have them, and they were used to putting things up, but they had purposely took it down because
So
they
not to
realized
offend.
so they could have those people over, because they weren't going to offend people who just, who'd come out and their attitude was they couldn't have anything to do with something like that at all anymore. And we need to consider those things.
Well, and that's one of the, Paul, when he's talking about the eating of meats and stuff like that's exactly what he's talking about, these cultural customs that people are used to, that we go, well, there's nothing wrong with that, and especially here, maybe we bring this up the United States, we're so used to all the different parts of being an American and saying, well, this is the way it's got to be, and if you're not doing it this way, then that's just wrong. And I mean, we look at it that, and we forget, we're not the only point of view, and not necessarily the things that we do in the United States are the right way, like this is the God-ordained way to do it. I mean, there's the God-ordained way to do it that's told to us in Scripture, but a lot of things are just cultural. And the culture is gonna make a determination here. Cole.
I agree with everything that's been said, but I also think this situation that he's referring to is Christians to non-Christians. So we've been
There's
talking
a lot of
about
that.
Christians to Christians, which to me is different than Christians to non-Christians. And I think he's trying to not prevent walls to be built at the start of it. And I think for me personally, this is my opinion, I think this can be not just physical appearance, which this was, in this case, was a physical appearance. But I think a lot of the times it's more of like in arts, if you're talking 21st century, if that's what you want to say, a lot of it is what you say and how you approach people.
It is.
Like in today's time, and like maybe politics, what you bring up in a conversation of politics, are you trying to start a fight? Then, and that to me is how I kind of view it today. This is just a personal opinion, but I think there can be physical actions in this, but in my mind, it's like starting with maybe something that is going to be controversial to this individual.
Yeah, and as you pass the mic over there, Jacob, I think one of the things we focused on a number of these things here was inside the church, and that's not necessarily the focus of this here. This is absolutely talking about how is my evangelism outward towards those who have yet to obey Christ? How can it not be hindered so that we can have the greatest impact to bring them in? And we're not going to compromise on what God says we believe as far as principle, but we're going to make sure that we follow what God says. Okay.
I think one of the differences too between Titus and Timothy is Titus was, it says specifically in Galatians, not forced to be circumcised, if this was a requirement. And this seems to also not be forced. I think that's what Acts 15 is about establishing. This is a choice that Timothy makes voluntarily. And what I hear in this, I kind of go along with what Cole said. Preaching the gospel, and we're all preachers in this sense. This is not just something that dedicated evangelists do. Preaching the gospel is not about me expressing myself and having my own individual rights. There are sacrifices to be made in pursuit of the goal. And Timothy is willing to make that. He is willing to, cut his body in pursuit of this willingly. Yeah. Just in the hopes that this might help someone come to Jesus. And so there are things in America, our air we breathe is so much about self-expression. I get to say what I want to say and do what I want to do. The gospel has a different perspective. And I think we really need to think about, is my goal really just to express myself, or is it to help people find Jesus? And so when Cole brings up politics, that's a door slammer for a lot of people. It is. And that may mean, just like the Jews, that may mean some prejudice on their part that needs to be overcome, just like the Jews kind of need to get over, I can't listen to someone who's not circumcised. They need to get over that. But that's not what they say. This is not, let's all criticize the Jews. It's instead, let's accommodate and sacrifice for ourselves to try to reach them. And this is the thought of the gospel. And I think we really need to think about politics is one area. That's just one.
Right.
A lot of the things that we say and do, we're just much more concerned about, am I fulfilled? Do I like it? Am I happy? Have I got to say my piece? Than we are, is this actually helping the people I'm trying to reach come closer to Jesus? So think about what I may need to sacrifice. In answer to Jim's question, there's so many things like that that will get in the way, that are just because I'm trying to be myself, and if you don't like me, that's your problem. That's really
Yeah.
not the way gospel preachers are to think.
That sounds like a sermon to me. You know. Okay. We have a comment here, or are we getting them all? Okay, go ahead.
I'm sure you have an agenda that you need to move forward
Yes.
and keep
That's
rolling.
okay. That's okay.
Here's the one thing, and it's probably the elephant in the room. This is not our freedom or license to go be like the world.
No, it is
Right?
absolutely
and so
not
we know
that.
Jesus is not contradictory. He tells us to what? Let our light shine.
Fine. Yes.
So these are moments in life where we might have the tendency to shy away from individuals or groups of people or scenarios where we can be an example like Jacob was talking about. But we be the example the way Jesus wants us to be the example. It's not our, call it what you want, license to sin and say, oh, I'm being like everybody else. But I'm doing it so that they'll find God.
Because they won't find God that way. I think it's how do we take, what you bring up, and I think others have said too, and what Jacob and Cole have said, and synthesize them, and it goes to the question of Jim here, and I think us trying to answer it. We've got to make sure we do not become like the world, but we've got to make sure that what we do does not hinder the gospel. That's, I had never really given that as much thought as I probably should until reading through this. Yeah, and that's, yes, and I think that's another thing, is it's this idea of separating yourself monastically, like the monks, and making it where you're not part of the world and you separate. You cannot have an impact unless you're in it and you're active in it and you're being seen by people. But how do you be different so your light shines? But how do you also not do stuff because of your personal biases, because of your personal thoughts, the way that your culture was, or whatever it may be, that's going to hinder the gospel going to this person or this person, making sure that we are doing what we can to spread God's gospel in the most, efficient, I don't know what way, but the way that ensures people see the way to Jesus. And that's what Paul was trying to do there. He understood that Timothy and the way he was a hindrance when they went into these synagogues here. And it was going to prevent people from listening, because they're going to be like, we can't listen to you. And it's a bias. But we can't let our own biases destroy the course of God's word. God's going to find a way. We don't need to be the hindrance to it. Oh yeah, I think excellent points here. We're going to move on here. I'm going to kind of quickly go over a few things here. So they in Lystra, they leave Lystra, and they're going to make their way. I think they're trying to make their way through Galatia, but they're denied some areas to go into by the Holy Spirit and by the Spirit of Jesus. We know about that. And finally, Paul sees this vision of a man in Macedonia calling for him to come over. And this is, I believe, God steering him to Europe. So we're going to end up in Europe. And that's where they head to next, and they go into Philippi. And I'm going to short-circuit this a bit so we can get to, hopefully, Athens here for the last 10 minutes or so. But in Philippi, we all know about kind of the events that occurred there. The first person that he encounters, and the first convert in Europe, is a woman by the name of Lydia. And he goes out. There's no synagogue there in Philippi. They're just out by a river, and he finds these women there, and he is able to convert Lydia. I do think it's very interesting that in almost every single one of these conversion accounts, in Philippi and in Thessalonica and in Berea, it lists off the people who follow. It says a number of the Jews follow, a number of the leading Greeks, and it says, and a number of the noble or high-ranking women. It's interesting that that's what's talked about, because in many of these societies that women weren't given many rights or thought of as second-class citizens, yet we find here the gospel has a direct impact upon them, and they are mentioned and mentioned prominently. And I think it shows you, again, the power of the gospel and how it goes through the stereotypes of culture, it goes through the stereotypes of gender, and it brings people, and it tells everyone that no matter who you are equal in God's sight. That's not what society says. Now, we have different roles, and we find that out. But God considers you equal. He wants you. You have the same worth as everyone else. And so it's interesting here, the first convert we have in Europe, which, again, starts pointing the way to us in 21st century America, is Lydia. And the impact that she has, because she clearly has an impact upon Paul's work there in Philippi, because they base out of her house. And she helps clearly in the things that are going on there. Okay, so in Philippi, we have this evangelism going on. They encounter this slave girl who follows them around and says to them, or says about them, these men are the servants of the Most High God, who proclaim to you the way of salvation. Now, this harkens back to some of the things that happens in the gospel when you have Christ encountering these demon-possessed people, and they immediately reference him. In Mark, the 5th chapter, who's got Mark 5? Mark 5. Mark 5, verses 6 through 7, we have the encounter of the demon, and it's many demons possessing this man in the Gadarenes. And what does this guy say, starting in verse 6 of Mark 5, Steve?
Mark 5, verses 6 and 7. And when he saw Jesus from afar, he ran and fell down before him. And crying out with a loud voice, he said, "What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I adjure you by God, do not torment me."
Okay, so what does he call him there? Son of the Most High God. That phrase, Most High God, would have a resonance among the Gentiles of the time. They were fed up with the capricious gods and goddesses of the Greek, Roman pantheon of the Gentile pagan religions. And some of them had come to believe in this single ultimate power, a Most High God. So when this slave girl says, these men are sent from the Most High God and proclaim to you the way of salvation, that right there has an impact upon these Gentiles, people who are already looking around. What we find here is that people are seeking God in their own way, trying to find him. That's what Paul's going to say to the Athenians in the Areopagus here in just a few minutes. And so we have all of these contexts, these layers going on in the Roman Empire, in the pagan world, the Gentile world at this time. There's kind of this undercurrent of looking for something that is beyond what they have been given by the pagan religions of the day. And God is right there to proclaim this message, this gospel. This is the message that they're seeking. Okay, so obviously Paul has enough of that and tosses out the demon, which gets him into trouble and gets them thrown into jail. Now, what's interesting is that these magistrates beat Paul and Silas. And that's a problem. I think we all know by our study of Scripture what that problem is. But Paul's going to save that and use that, which is interesting because Paul always seems to have this trump card that he's ready to play. So he's kind of wise to the world and how it works. And so he's not just always the naive, innocent person. He's kind of got this ready to play. And he's going to bring it out here in just a bit. And so we know the story of the Philippian jailer. We know what ends up happening there. And this earthquake that occurs that frees all the prisoners, but they don't leave, and he's about to kill himself. And then he cries out, Paul cries out, don't kill yourself. We read when that Philippian jailer comes to him and says, what must I do to be saved? We read that as Christians. What is it that I must do to be saved by God? And I think the problem is that the real point of view is coming from a pagan. What must I do to be saved from the wrath of the gods? That's really, I think, what the jailer is saying to him. And of course, Paul takes that opportunity to proclaim Jesus to him and says, if you believe on Jesus, you and your household can be saved. Now, there's a lot to unpack from that statement. Now, the religious world's going to tell you that statement is like, well, you just need to call upon Jesus. But belief in Jesus, I think we've talked about this, is so much deeper than praying a prayer to him. There's so much more there. There is a lifetime of things packaged in the statement of believe on Jesus. Because even with the Philippian jailer and his household listening to what he says, they understand they must be saved and they've got to be baptized, and they are. And it says in that very hour they are baptized. So it's important for us to remember, and I think for everyone to remember, that belief in Jesus, and it's not just Jesus, he calls him Lord Jesus. Again, what are we acknowledging about Jesus? He's our King. And this is an important thing that's undercurrent that's going on in this time. They're going to accuse Paul of teaching things that turn the world upside down. Well, the world has been turned upside down because, as I said a couple of weeks ago, the message that Jesus is preaching is a radical message. It's taking people out of the pagan world, the world with all of these gods that you and your neighbors have worshipped for who knows how many millennia. And now you're being translated into a world where God is the only God. He is your king, and you're acknowledging that. And you still have out here the Roman Empire, and you still have these gods that are in the lives of all your friends and neighbors. And you've got to live in this new world, and you've got to swear allegiance to a God and a king. And that makes you a bit different. In fact, it makes you very different from everybody else. And it means a big change, one that we can scarcely imagine as Americans, as we've talked about, who are Christians, because we ostensibly live in a Christian nation, which may or may not be the case, really. So all of that occurs, and eventually the magistrates say, you're free to go, and Paul says, no, I'm not leaving. I'm not leaving. You got to come down and get me. Because what you did is illegal. I'm a Roman citizen. You can't beat me without a trial. And you didn't give me a trial. And so, of course, they were concerned about that. There was a precedent for that. In 70 BC, Cicero prosecuted Gaius Verres, the former governor of Sicily, for corruption. And one of the crimes that he was prosecuted for was crucifying a Roman citizen unlawfully by the name of Publius Gavius. So these guys knew they were in serious trouble. You couldn't do that. They had been accused, Paul had been accused of spreading teachings that were unlawful for Roman citizens to follow. And he ends up accusing the magistrates of unlawfully beating him. And of course, that gets him out. Okay, so they leave Philippi. The situation there is a bit untenable. And so they leave there. And quickly, they go on to Thessalonica. Same thing, kind of pattern occurs in Thessalonica and then Berea, and they are forced to leave those places, some of them under the cover of night. And eventually, Paul ends up leaving Berea himself on the way to Athens and leaves both Timothy and, I believe, Silas there in Berea. And so he arrives himself in Athens. And we're not going to have much time here to go into Athens. And that's unfortunate because there's a lot to unpack from what goes on in his defense. Now, in his book, Paul, a biography, N.T. Wright asserts that the Areopagus is really a sort of court where the leaders of the Athenian people gather together and hear different cases, some of which are religious, and would deal with situations like this, potentially of Paul teaching something that was different. In fact, Wright argues that Paul was under some kind of potential threat of his life here. And so depending on how it went, it could end up badly for Paul. In 399 BC, Socrates was put on trial in Athens for the crime of corrupting the young and introducing foreign divinities. What do the Athenians say in Acts 17? Who's got Acts 17? Did I pass out Acts 17? Oh, Brandon over there. Yeah. Acts 17. What do they say, verses 18 through 20? Brandon?
Acts 17, verses 18 through 20. Some of the Epicurean and Stoic philosophers also conversed with him, and some said, "What does this babbler wish to say?" Others said, "He seems to be a preacher of foreign divinities, because he was preaching Jesus and the resurrection." And they took him and brought him to the Areopagus, saying, "May we know what this new teaching is that you're presenting? For you are presenting some strange things to our ears. We wish to know, therefore, what these things mean."
Okay. The same charge that is made against Cicero in 399 in this very court, the Areopagus, is made against Paul here in Acts the 17th chapter about preaching about foreign divinities. He's specifically preaching about Jesus, and they didn't understand exactly what he meant by the resurrection. And there's some background on that deals with the founding of the Areopagus that we're not going to get to, unfortunately, this morning. So they clearly here in Acts 17, I think, are wanting to know what he's talking about. And I don't think it's just hey, it'd be nice if you kind of explained yourself. It's more like you really need to explain yourself, and if you don't explain yourself in a way we like, this could end very badly for you. So I think it lends a bit different tone and environment to exactly what Paul is saying here. He's having to make a very impassioned and important defense of the things that he's talking about, such that the Greeks don't basically end up rioting, maybe kind of like the Sanhedrin did when Stephen said the things that he did back in Acts the 7th chapter. So with that, and boy, we're out of time here, but we read in Acts 17 there are two schools of thought, the Epicurean and the Stoic schools of thought as far as philosophy. And the Epicureans are interesting because they believe that the gods may well exist, but they're in a world entirely separate from humans. But they believe in these things they call atoms, and that they move all around, and they swirl around, and they're colliding with one another, producing different effects and different evolving life forms. And everything in this world, in human life, must have a natural cause. And at death, these constituent atoms that make up you and me disperse so that human people, the soul ceases to exist. There's no more. It doesn't exist anymore. Sound familiar? This is a philosophy that we kind of have today. That just, you live, and then if you die, once you die, it's all over. There's no more. Now, the thing about this is, this was a minority world viewpoint up until the 18th century. That's not what people really widely believe. But since that point, especially through evolution and the tenets of that and the principles of that, it has become a dominant world thought mindset in the Western world. And people think that it is a new discovery. This is something new that modern man has come up with. What does that tell you? The things that people think are new are really just recycled old principles. And will believe exactly the same thing as these people did, as the Epicureans did. Interesting. Unfortunately, there's a lot more there to unpack, and maybe we'll talk about it this next week.